Notre Dame wins their first ever matchup in the ACC. Clemson looks sharp against Wake Forest, plus all the other storylines from Week 2 of the college football season. I'm Jay Smith, and this is After Further Review.
And now, after further review, a Clemson student's perspective on sports.
There's a personal foul on number 99 of the defense. After he tackled the quarterback, he's giving them business down there. That's a 15-yard penalty.
Well, welcome in, everyone. I'm Jay Smith, and again, this is After Further Review. Thanks so much for tuning in, whether it is the podcast or if you're watching on Facebook. Do appreciate you taking the time to go over some college football highlights. Week 2 happened this past weekend, and this was the first week that we really got a chance to see what the season was going to look like in terms of, the protocols for COVID-19, but also gave us a good chance to look at some of the bigger programs in the country and, what that was going to look like for them, their season opening games, and how they were going to perform. Had a pair of top 5 teams play this past weekend. Obviously, Clemson took on Wake Forest. That game was Saturday night game of the week. And then Oklahoma played Missouri State. Neither game was really very exciting. We'll get to both of them in a second, but we do want to start off the show going over Notre Dame, their first ACC matchup ever this past weekend against the Duke Blue Devils. Notre Dame played this one at home and won this one 27-13. And it was a pretty strong debut for the Fighting Irish in the ACC. Ian Book for Notre Dame was 19 for 31 for 263 yards and a touchdown. And honestly, analyzing this game, looking at this game, on paper, it looks a little bit, there was a little bit more separation than what actually transpired, and this game was actually a little bit closer than the final score indicated, and Duke hung around. You got to give credit to the Blue Devils. Chase Bryce, former Clemson backup quarterback, performed pretty well on the road. He went 20 for 37 for 259 yards. Duke did struggle on the ground. Their leading rusher only was able to get 52 yards on 15 carries. But, this was a game that, again, week 1 for both of these teams, and obviously Notre Dame playing in a conference game for the first time. And so there was a lot to kind of feel out, and you could tell that first quarter when Notre Dame came out, and they weren't really clicking on offense. In fact, Duke was the only point scored in the first quarter with the Blue Devils with a field goal. And we went into the locker room with a 10-6 score, and you could tell that Notre Dame was going to make some adjustments, and they were going to try and come out and do some things differently in the second half. And to their credit, they were able to accomplish that. I wouldn't say that this game ever felt like Duke was going to pull off the upset, but it certainly was interesting, and it gave people a reason to tune in to NBC Saturday afternoon to check in on how this game was going. Honestly, though, I think this is more a credit to Duke and where they are as a program than it is to say, look at Notre Dame. They're not really even able to blow out a middle tier or bottom tier ACC team. I mean, Duke has obviously had some years of success recently. I mean, David Cutcliffe has done a lot for that program. But again, I think it's more a testament to the fact that Duke is, a pretty decent contender now in the ACC. And I almost wanted to mention their division for a second, but then I remembered that there are no divisions in the ACC this year. So it's very different. Again, there's a lot of everybody kind of feeling out how this is going to work, what the format's going to look like, and the flow of the season, and obviously not having any non-conference games is going to be different. But overall, I think this is a good win for Notre Dame to start off the season. They were able to flex their muscles a little bit, and I was pretty impressed with their performance. I think that obviously this is something that they're going to have to build upon. And again, when you look at Notre Dame's schedule, They do have South Florida next week, and then they're going to go to Wake Forest. Florida State, who we'll actually talk about in a little bit later in the show, not much competition amongst those three teams right there. So you would expect them to roll into the Louisville game on October 17th at 4-0, and that's going to present the first big test for the Fighting Irish this season is that Louisville game. It's going to be at home. Again, I know that with the limited attendance, the impact of a home environment is reduced, and we're actually going to get into some of the specifics and the numbers of that a little bit later. But needless to say, Notre Dame right now testing the waters. They got their first conference win under their belt. That's great for establishing positive momentum. Wake Forest and Florida State should easily fold over for the Fighting Irish, and I would expect them to go into the Louisville game with a lot riding on it. But then you have Pitt that next week on the road, and so it's going to be tricky. Their back half of the schedule with Louisville, Pitt on the road. They host Clemson. They travel to UNC. You sprinkle a Georgia Tech team in there. An on-the-road game for Notre Dame, and that's a tricky middle to back half of the schedule for the Fighting Irish. So, it's really going to be interesting to see how this team develops throughout the season and what adjustments they need to make when they get into those matchups with tough teams, with the teams like Clemson and the teams like UNC and even Pitt on the road. I mean, those are going to pose challenges to the Fighting Irish. But yeah, overall, I think a great opening game for Notre Dame and an impressive way to start the season. If we go back and we look at some of the scores, obviously Clemson played Wake Forest. That game 37-13, and this one was really never close like the Notre Dame Duke game was. Clemson came out early. They established momentum. Lawrence looked really sharp. He went 22 for 28, 351 yards and a touchdown. And again, this was more of, I really think, a national showcase. This was a game that Clemson could use as an opening Saturday night and say, hey, look, this is us. We're still planning on competing for a national championship this year, even with everything else going on and COVID causing a lot of uncertainty. The Tigers' whole thing this offseason leading up to this, especially what Dabo has been echoing, is just we want to play. Doesn't matter where it is, how it is, what it looks like. We just want to play some games. And to their credit, they came out, they were focused, and they played with a lot of poise. And that's something that Clemson in the past has struggled with at times, especially with conference opponents that they, should beat handily, right? That we're talking about, NC State from a few years ago at home. They should have routed them. Ended up having to rely on a missed field goal. We're talking about the Pitt game where they lost at home. We're talking about Syracuse where they lost on the road. Games that, yes, those teams were talented. That's not to discount, the talent on the Pitt roster or the NC State roster or the Syracuse roster. But Clemson was clearly that day the more talented team. They just didn't play like it. So that opportunity presented itself in this game, and Clemson certainly could have played down to Wake Forest. In credit to Wake Forest, the first few possessions on defense, they came out inspired. They were trying to make big plays. I think they got a little bit overly aggressive, and I think that that cost them because Lawrence and his pinpoint accuracy. I mean, he was able to burn these guys, and there's just too many weapons. I mean, there's just too many weapons. You got guys like Etienne out there. I mean, you got Amari Rodgers. I mean, there's just so many weapons for Clemson that it's really, really difficult for anybody, let alone a team in the ACC like Wake Forest, to compete against these guys for 60 minutes. I mean, it's going to be challenging no matter who they go up against. Now, I believe, and I'd have to go back and reference the stat I saw, but I want to say that Clemson took 70 players on this trip, and I think 68 of them played. I would have to double check that to make sure that I'm completely accurate, but I believe this statistic I saw, which was from David Hood of TigerNet, was that 68 of the 70 players that traveled with Clemson played in that game, which again I've talked about this on this show for years. That's a testament not only to the culture that Dabo has created and the idea of everybody should play, if you're traveling with the team and we're in a position where we can put you in, like we're gonna play you, but it's also a testament how deep this roster is and how the coaching staff trusts these guys, on the second and third string, way down in the depth chart, to come on the field and perform at the same level that those first string guys perform at. And one of the biggest things too is you'll always see Trevor Lawrence, or a couple years ago it was Christian Wilkins, those leaders of the team, first ones out on the field congratulating the guys that just made a big play, that scored maybe or whatever. I mean, there always seems to be a sense of competition but camaraderie amongst the roster for Clemson. Guys that they're competing against each other, right? I mean, we've seen that most recently. I think the most obvious example would be with Kelly Bryant and Trevor Lawrence, and obviously that situation ended differently from a lot of what's happened at Clemson recently, but I still think that there was mutual respect between the players themselves. Now, maybe Kelly had some issues with the coaching staff or how the message was delivered, that he was no longer going to be the starter. But to my knowledge, both Kelly and Trevor had a lot of respect for one another, and you see that across the board with Clemson. That's something that they really pride themselves on, and so that's I think something that a lot of schools and programs should strive for, because that's something that you really like to see. And so again, for Clemson, good opening win. Nothing really else to talk about here. I mean, I could give you a bunch of statistics, but you've probably already seen them. And if you're listening to this podcast, I'm going to assume you watched the game. And so there's really nothing I can add besides the fact that, look, it's the opening game of the year. Clemson took care of business. They're 1-0. They have the Citadel next week. We all know how that's going to go. And so right now, Clemson just needs to take care of business on a week-to-week basis, and they really should be fine. There really is not a whole lot of obstacles in their way for a ACC championship berth, and then obviously a college football playoff berth. Let's switch over now to talking about some of the other conferences. We've gone over two games in the ACC, and I think it's important to highlight some of the other games that were played this past week. Obviously, the SEC has not started play yet. They'll do that on, I believe, the 26th is the official start date. So there's not a lot. There are not a lot of games right now. It's pretty slow, and so you're kind of just watching whatever you can find on your TV. And Oklahoma, Missouri State is probably a game that you didn't watch unless you're an Oklahoma fan. I do feel sorry for you if you are a Missouri State fan, but nevertheless, Oklahoma performed very well. Spencer Rattler for Oklahoma was really sharp. 14 for 17 for nearly 300 yards and 4 TDs. I mean, this one was over by the end of the first quarter. I mean, it was 31-0 at the end of the first, and the final score ended up being 48-0. So basically a tune-up game for Oklahoma. This did not challenge them. I saw a couple articles. I want to say one was from the USA Today talking about how Oklahoma's offense proved that they're legit, that they're the real deal. Rattler's proven that he can be in the contention for Heisman, and I'm like, well, okay, okay. I mean, this is week one, first off, and this is Missouri State, so. I'm not saying that it means nothing, because a win is a win, but if I'm a Heisman voter, or if I'm anybody critiquing Oklahoma, I'm circling that Texas game. I'm circling that Texas game on October 10th, which strangely enough is a noon kickoff. That I'm not sure I understand why the Red River rivalry would be a noon kickoff, unless that is typical. I don't believe it is. I want to say I've seen them play in the afternoon at least before, or in the evening, but nevertheless, noon kickoff for the Red River rivalry game between Oklahoma and Texas. That is the game I want to watch for a multitude of reasons, but mainly to see who from the Big 12 is going to emerge. Is it going to be Oklahoma, or is it going to be Texas? And we'll have a couple of weeks, leading up to that game, which will give us an idea of, okay, what are Oklahoma's strengths? What are their weaknesses? What are Texas's strengths? What are their weaknesses? How is Ellinger going to compare to Rattler? What is each team going to bring to that game, and how are they going? Because look, the Big 12 we all know is heavy on the offensive side. You're going to have a lot of points. You're probably not going to have a lot of defense. Amazingly enough, I'm looking here at some stats for both schools, and both teams right now averaging over 600 yards a game. Texas at 689 and Oklahoma at 608. Obviously, Texas played UTEP last weekend and won that game 59-3. So not a lot of competition for either of these teams week one. Texas is going to travel to Texas Tech, and then they're going to host TCU before they play Oklahoma. So I think, again, it's a little early to pass judgment on either the Longhorns or the Sooners. I'm not saying that we should completely ignore the Big 12 until middle October, but take it with a grain of salt. Wait to pass judgment on the Big 12 rather, and what sort of college football playoff caliber team may emerge from that conference, because it's just too early. It's just too early. I mean, you really can say that about any team right now. It's just too early to know. But yeah, I mean, again, those games in the Big 12 obviously do matter, and it was worth mentioning. Let's see now. We've got an interesting upset actually from this past weekend was Louisiana Lafayette. They took down Iowa State in rather shocking fashion, 31-14. Honestly, this was a game that I expected Iowa State to handle relatively easily, and I'm pretty concerned for the Cyclones, going forward, because this is going to do a number on their confidence. And this game was started out in favor of Iowa State. They put together a really nice drive in the first quarter. It was an 8-play, 49-yard drive in 3.5 minutes, textbook all the way. And then Raging Cajuns tied it up with a 95-yard kickoff return. So immediately the next play, they've tied the ball game up. And you could tell that kind of shook the confidence of the Cyclones, but they did tack on another touchdown a few minutes later. Again, another textbook drive, 7 plays, 69 yards, just under 3 minutes. Raging Cajuns tacked on a field goal, so it ended at the first quarter 14-10. So a close ball game, some momentum swings, but overall, again, looking at the box score, Iowa State's got 2 great drives in the first quarter. 2 drives that were the first 49 yards, the second 69 yards, basically at least half the field, both of those times, whereas Louisiana Lafayette's got a kickoff return and a field goal. So I'm still putting my money on Iowa State. But it really slowed down. Excuse me, this was in the second quarter. I think I said first quarter a second ago. This was in the second quarter. So this was going into the half. Excuse me, not at the end of the first quarter. So moving on to the second half, this is where the game really got away from Iowa State, and the Raging Cajuns were able to score a touchdown in the third quarter, and then 2 more touchdowns in the fourth quarter. What was really surprising, though, is that Iowa State actually outgained Louisiana Lafayette. They outgained them 303-272, but the 2 turnovers in this game for Iowa State is what really did them in. And again, a lot of credit to Louisiana Lafayette for capitalizing off of those mistakes and, putting up touchdowns. And so, a 31-14 final score with this game being at Iowa State really makes you scratch your head and go, well, where do you go from here? This was supposed to be a season opening kind of tune-up game, nothing crazy. And the reason that this is really concerning for the Cyclones is because, you got TCU on the road next week, on the 26th, so not this coming weekend, but the next. But then you've got Oklahoma on October 3rd, and that game is at home, but it's hard to imagine, based off of what we saw from Oklahoma this past weekend and Iowa State, that Iowa State's going to be able to compete. And if they're not able to, if they're not going to be able to compete against Oklahoma, well, 2 weeks later when they travel to Oklahoma State, they likely drop that game as well, and then all of a sudden your season's really lost in terms of competing for a Big 12 championship. I mean, the Texas game, way down at the end of the schedule, November 27th on the road, that doesn't even look relevant anymore because you've dropped your two biggest games, right? Assuming you lose to Oklahoma and Oklahoma State, what are you playing for? So it really not a great start for Iowa State. I wouldn't say that this season is over, but I think if they can, assuming Oklahoma beats them, I think that's a very safe bet. If they can beat Oklahoma State on the road or Texas on the road, they can salvage this season. But if you lose, Oklahoma State, and Texas, you're going to finish finish 8 and what would that be? 8-4. Are we still playing 12 games in the Big 12? I think we're playing 10. Right, I counted that correctly. Yes, we are playing 10. So you would finish 6-4, 6-4 for the Cyclones, which would not be good at all. And so you've got to pick up one of those games. Most likely, I would say, is Oklahoma State on the road, and then the best you're going to finish is 7-3. So that's a rough start for Iowa State. It does help with the separation though in the Big 12. It gives us a clearer picture of who's going to be at the top and who's not going to be at the top. But yeah, this was an interesting game, and the reason I'm spending so much time talking about it is because it kind of came out of nowhere. It was a game that I really wasn't expecting I'd have to pay attention to, and then as the game drug on, I was like, whoa, especially getting into that second half where the Cyclones just weren't able to get anything going. It became apparent, probably I'd say about the end of the third quarter, that Louisiana Lafayette was going to win the game, which, again, credit to them. I think they played really, really well. But some other storylines from week 2 that jumped out at me, switching gears from just a review of this past week, I would say one of the biggest things is Florida State's still in shambles. I mean, Florida State is a team that, when Jimbo left, lost a lot of their identity, and at the time, the perception of Florida State was I think higher than Texas A&M. I mean, Kevin Sumlin, obviously had some great years, and Johnny Manziel brought some notoriety to Texas A&M, but by and large, Florida State was still more of a national brand. They were still considered at least a powerhouse of recruiting. I won't say a powerhouse of competing, every single year, but obviously Jameis Winston. Florida State is always in the conversation. Texas A&M not so much. And when Jimbo left for A&M, I think it really did a number on the pride of that program and the school, and they really didn't know how to respond. And so when Taggart came in, it was almost like trying to bail out the Titanic. I mean, the boat was already sinking, right? Jimbo, he steered the ship into the iceberg, and then he got off on the first rowboat, and then Taggart comes in, and the ship is sinking, and they give Taggart a pail, and they say, "Okay, Taggart, start bailing us out." And he's trying to get water over as fast as possible. He's sitting there with his bucket, and he's bailing them out, and the Titanic's still going to sink. It's still going to sink, and that is what we're watching right now. I mean, we are watching a juggernaut, a juggernaut from the Bobby Bowden era sink. I mean, these guys they're just dropping further than I've ever thought they really could. I mean, it was amazing to me is as I was watching the game against Georgia Tech, I just realized that the Seminoles have not reached the bottom yet. They are still descending from that elite program to an afterthought, and an afterthought in a conference that right now is desperate for anybody to be decent. I mean, you've got Clemson. North Carolina has started to come onto the scene, but you've had so many teams go through that revolving door of, relevancy where, Virginia Tech, Miami, Syracuse. I mean, they haven't been able to maintain consistency. And so for Florida State, just the realization that this team is still descending is pretty incredible. Obviously, there was a lot of optimism when Mike Norvell from Memphis, came in, and obviously, it was his first game, but, 2 seasons with Willie Taggart, I really expected them to turn it around at this point. I really would have, if you'd have told me 3 or 4 years ago that Florida State was going to struggle and lose to Georgia Tech at home, I don't think anybody, I would not have believed you. I don't think anybody really would have. But, and again, I'm not just trying to dump on Florida State, although that sometimes is fun. It's important to note. I mean, listen. Florida State has lost their 4th consecutive season opener. I mean, that right there, that statistic, and actually I saw another statistic this weekend, and I'm trying to remember what, I think it had something to do with longest streak of like conference losses, maybe. I'm not sure. I'll have to do some digging, and then maybe I'll put something out on Twitter about it. But nevertheless, going back to the 4th straight season opening loss for Florida State, the 3 of those 4 have been at home for the Seminoles. That's embarrassing. I mean, that's not just like, that's embarrassing. To lose 4 consecutive season openers and 3 of those games be at home, which basically means you're supposed to win this game. It's not a marquee matchup unless it's like a neutral site location. Speaks to a larger problem right now in Tallahassee. And, they jumped out to a 10-0 lead. They looked a little inspired. They looked like they were playing for their new coach. And then they just blew opportunities over and over and over. They dropped a pick 6, a touchdown pass in the first half, and Georgia Tech hung around. And you got to credit the Yellow Jackets because when that fast start for Florida State started to wane off, Georgia Tech pounced and Florida State wilted. I mean, they just wilted. They had 3 turnovers. They couldn't establish the running game. A lot of penalties at key moments in the game. And I think it's a really impressive performance by true freshman quarterback for Georgia Tech, Jeff Sims. And again, he had a shaky start, obviously, and was able to kind of recover from that. But again, I was really impressed with his performance. I think the fact that Doak Campbell wasn't at max capacity probably, made it a little bit easier for him. But listen, Georgia Tech came out slow, but they slowly took control of the game. It almost reminded me, a little bit lesser so, but it almost reminded me of the Clemson-Ohio State semifinal game that's so famous, where Clemson just looked awful. I mean, they just looked awful in the first half. And slowly but surely took over that game, came back into the game, were competitive, and ended up winning the game. And that's kind of what we saw here with Georgia Tech and Florida State. Rather shocked, honestly. Rather shocked that that Florida State lost this game, especially at home. I don't know what the Mike Norvell era is going to look like at Florida State, and I'm not saying that this one game is going to define like their entire season. Obviously, that's not that's not going to be the case. But I really think there's going to be some serious questions now when you look at how they performed and how they played. Because I just I don't think they're done dropping. I really don't. I mean, they're about as pedestrian, to borrow a phrase from Walt Deptula over at 105.5 The Roar. They're about as pedestrian as you can be right now, and in the ACC nonetheless, which certainly doesn't make you look any better. But yeah, I mean, overall, like I said, week 2, I thought had some good games, some interesting games. I think Notre Dame and Duke was a game that a lot of people enjoyed. North Carolina and Syracuse was also an interesting game. I think there's a few lingering questions for North Carolina after that performance because the final score of 31-6 looks like, oh well, this game was never close, but in actuality, this game was 10-6 going into the fourth quarter. North Carolina hung up 21 points in that fourth quarter to give a final score of 31-6. But there's still a few questions for North Carolina in terms of consistency and what will Sam Howell for them, what will he be able to do for them throughout the season against tougher opponents? Because here's the thing, right? They had one good quarter in this game, and they still beat Syracuse by 25 points. Well, if you're playing a Clemson, or if you're playing, another, a team in another conference like an Oklahoma or Texas, if you're in a bowl situation, or even an SEC team, I hesitate to use Big Ten team examples just because I don't really know what's all going to happen with the Big Ten. Because as of this recording, there has been no confirmed schedule for the Big Ten. Obviously, the vote is happening, but no confirmed news at this point while this show is being recorded. But still, the larger point is that North Carolina's going to have to show the ability to string together an entire 60 minutes of consistent football before I can sit there and say, oh yeah, I think North Carolina could hang with Clemson in an ACC championship. And so, it was a game that was relatively interesting until the fourth quarter, and then the Tar Heels pulled away. I think Mac Brown will use this as a good example to show his team, listen, hey, we're in the top 25. We're actually in the top 20, sitting at 18 right now, but that doesn't mean that every game's going to be a cakewalk. We're still going to have to go out there. We're still going to have to earn it, and we're going to have to compete. And so hopefully he'll be able to get that message across to his team. But yeah, I guess the biggest upset, obviously, from this past week was Louisiana Lafayette taking down Iowa State in such dominating fashion, 31-14. But there's still a lot of games to look forward to for Week 3. We will dive into those in the next show, which will come later this week, probably Thursday or Friday. But yeah, and again, I wanted to mention this at the beginning of the show, but I'll mention it now. If you are not already in the college football pick'em league for AFR, I believe the actual name of the college pick'em league or the name of the group is AFR College Pick'em 2020, and I will repost the link to join that college pick'em group out on the show's social media, the Facebook page, the Instagram page, the Twitter page. We have quite a few people in there so far. I think about 15 people in there so far. But be sure to get in there if that's something that you want to do. This is, I think, the third or fourth year that we've actually done a college pick'em league. It's a ton of fun, and it allows listeners and people that enjoy the show to make their picks. And usually what I'll do is make an episode a week where I will, go over the picks for this week and talk about them and may even field some questions. I'm thinking about starting a series where, and this would probably run through Instagram DMs, where if people have a topic or something that they want discussed on the show, or a question or a comment or anything really, they can DM the show's account, and I'll discuss it on air, or if we can work out a way to bring you on the show, that'll work too. I'm always down for that, and always enjoy talking to people that listen to the show and that enjoy it. But yeah, for sure, be sure to join the College Pick'em League. Again, I will post the link to that probably sometime soon, later this week. You have until the 26th to make your selections for Week 1, so there's not a huge rush, but be sure to get in there as soon as you can, and tell your friends if they are not already in a group, or if they want to join a group but they've never done it before. More than welcome. So there is that to look forward to. But yeah, I think that pretty much wraps it up for this week's show. Always enjoy bringing another edition of After Further Review. Thanks so much for listening, tuning in. Be sure to get into that Pick'em League when you have time, and appreciate you listening.